I never thought a single day could ruin everything I'd built in decades. While I was hospitalized, my own nephew took over my business and pretended it was his. But when I returned, his empire started collapsing faster than he could ever imagine. Hit subscribe if you believe life always finds a way to balance the scales. Because this story proves it. I never thought a single day could change everything I'd built in over 3 decades. One moment, I was running through my to-do list like any other morning, checking on my crews, signing off on bids, and sipping my black coffee while the sun climbed over Cincinnati. And the next, I was flat on the floor of my kitchen, clutching my chest, gasping for air, and realizing that my life as I knew it could end right there. The doctors later told me it was a cardiac emergency, a freak accident no one could have predicted, but in that moment, lying on the cold tile and staring at the ceiling, I felt the weight of my entire life settle on me. I'm Frank Bennett, 58, and I've spent every ounce of my energy building Bennett renovations from nothing. 32 years ago, I scraped together a tiny loan, a beat-up pickup truck, and a tool belt full of secondhand gear to start my own home renovation company. I worked from sunup to sundown, often skipping meals, missing birthdays, and sacrificing weekends. Also, I could build something my family and community could rely on. I never imagined I would have to defend it from someone I'd raised myself. That someone was my nephew, Evan. Charming, smooth-talking 27, with a smile that could sell anything, and a laziness that made me grind twice as hard. He was my brother's son. My brother passed away when Evan was 12, and I promised his mother I'd help raise him right. I thought I had. I thought I had taught him everything about hard work, responsibility, and honor. Turns out, I'd only taught him how to fake it. The morning of my collapse started like any other. I woke at 5:30, brewed coffee, and checked on my crews working at a high-profile renovation downtown. The phones never stop ringing in my business, and my inbox is a battlefield of contracts, invoices, and client complaints. I was still going through the emails when I felt it. A crushing pain in my chest, and a cold sweat that soaked my shirt in seconds. I stumbled toward the kitchen counter for support, thinking maybe I just needed water or a moment to breathe. Then the room started spinning, and everything went black. I woke in the hospital hours later, groggy and terrified. The doctor told me I had suffered a heart attack, probably due to a combination of stress, long hours, and ignoring the warning signs for years. They hooked me up to monitors, insisted on surgery to install a stent, and warned me to rest for weeks. Weeks? I had never sat idle for a full day in my life, and the thought of someone else touching my business while I was helpless filled me with dread. Evan, of course, was there. Or at least, he appeared to be. At first, he was charming, concerned, and eager to help out. He visited me in the hospital daily, texting updates and promising me that everything was under control. I should have been relieved. But something in his eyes, too bright, too eager, too rehearsed, made me uneasy. My gut, which had guided me through thousands of home renovations, screamed that something wasn't right. And then came the first sign. A text message from our office manager, Melissa, late one evening while I was still under sedation. Evan had a staff meeting today. He said he's taking over operations while you recover. Everyone's on board. Just so you know. My stomach dropped. I reread it 3 times, each pass feeling heavier than the last. Taking over operations. That's not what family does when someone's sick. Family supports, family protects. But Evan, he was moving in for the kill. I wanted to call Melissa, yell at her, ask her why she hadn't stopped him. But my voice was weak, and I was tethered to machines that beeped with every heartbeat. All I could do was stare at the ceiling, my mind racing through decades of hard work, thinking about what it meant to have someone so close betray me. The next days blurred into a haze of painkillers, physical therapy, and phone calls that were mostly cryptic updates from Evan. "Everything's fine, Uncle. Don't worry. The staff loves me. Fine." The words grated on me like nails on a chalkboard. My business isn't just fine. It's my legacy. It's my sweat, my blood. My nights spent watching projects and worrying if the foundation would hold. I couldn't imagine letting it slip through someone else's hands, especially someone who hadn't earned it. I tried to reach my lawyer, a grizzled veteran named Paul, who had helped me incorporate the company and navigate decades of contracts and disputes. But Evan, ever the smooth operator, had intercepted some of my communications. Every time I tried to reach Paul directly, Evan somehow made it seem like I didn't need to worry. He framed himself as the responsible one, the caretaker of my empire while I was incapacitated. And my staff, Melissa, was too intimidated to speak up fully, and the new hires even had brought in friends from his college days. We're all too eager to kiss up to the new boss. It didn't take long for me to see the cracks. Small things at first: a missing invoice here, an unusual withdrawal there, a contract signed by someone I didn't recognize. Then, hints of arrogance. Evan started buying flashy suits, expensive gadgets, even boasting about a Range Rover he had just picked up to impress the crew. While I was fighting for my life, he was indulging himself with money that wasn't his. I felt a pit in my stomach, a mixture of rage and disbelief. How could someone I had raised be so blind to the sacrifices that built this company? The emotional weight was crushing. I spent nights lying awake, staring at the hospital ceiling lights, imagining my crews, my clients, my reputation being hijacked right under my nose. All those years of building trust and respect in the community, gone in weeks if I didn't act. And yet, I was powerless. All I could do was collect fragments of information, piece them together in my mind, and prepare for the moment I could finally get out of that hospital bed. And then came the message that made my blood run cold. It wasn't from Melissa this time. It was from Ivan himself. Short, smug, and infuriating. "Don't worry, Uncle. The business is in good hands. I'm running things now. Just focus on getting better." That's when the cold reality hit me. He wasn't planning to hand it back. Not voluntarily. He had positioned himself as CEO, with my name sidelined, with forged signatures and staff who would vouch for him. All the charm, all the reassurances. It was a trap. And for the first time in 32 years, I realized that my life's work, everything I had built, could be stolen from me while I lay helpless. But if Evan thought this was the end of the story, he was sorely mistaken. He had underestimated one thing: the man who could endure pain, fight betrayal, and rise stronger from it. Lying there, weak but not broken, I began to plan, not just to recover, but to reclaim everything that was mine. The hospital became a place of strategy. I used brief moments of clarity to write notes, remember conversations, record every inconsistency. Each beep of the monitor was a reminder that time was fleeting, and every moment Ivan continued to act as if he owned my company. He dug himself deeper into the mess that was soon to collapse under his arrogance. By the time I was finally discharged, one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same. Not my health, not my trust, and certainly not my business. And for Evan, the nightmare that he had so eagerly prepared for himself was about to begin. Though he had no idea just how fast it would come crashing down. When I finally stepped out of the hospital, the Ohio air hit me like a slap. It should have felt like freedom, like a breath of life after weeks of machines, beeping, and the sterile smell of antiseptic. But instead, it felt heavy, like every step I took toward my office was a countdown to disaster. My heart was weak, my body trembling from medications, and yet my mind burned with anticipation. I wasn't just walking back into a building. I was walking into the aftermath of a betrayal I had only glimpsed in fragments. The drive to the office was surreal. Streets I had driven 1,000 times felt foreign. My neighborhood, usually a comforting reminder of everything I had built, now seemed like a stage set for a nightmare. And then I saw it, the first sign that my fears weren't exaggeration. The company trucks, my pride and symbols of decades of hard work, were parked at odd angles, freshly painted with the company logo in a color I hadn't approved. Bright blue, flashy. Wrong. I parked my own truck, still mine, still original, and stepped out, taking a slow, cautious approach. My office door was new, different locks. Even had already anticipated that I might return, and he'd made sure I couldn't simply walk in and reclaim what was mine. My stomach churned as I fished the spare key out of my pocket, the one I kept hidden in case of emergencies, and unlocked the door. Inside, it was a different world. The familiar scent of wood polish and sawdust had been replaced with an overwhelming aroma of cheap cologne, energy drinks, and expensive coffee beans from a machine I didn't own. The staff, normally bustling and smiling, froze as I entered. Melissa, my office manager for 15 years, avoided my gaze, her hands clutching papers, as if they could shield her from the chaos. Some of the younger employees, hired by Evan, grinned nervously at him from behind desks. And then he appeared. Evan, in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire first-year revenue, standing in the middle of the office like he owned it. Which, technically, in the eyes of the staff, he did. He smiled when he saw me, a smug, confident grin that made my blood boil. "Welcome back, Uncle Frank," he said, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "You're looking better. Much better." I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. Better. Ithern. What happened here? What did you do? His smile widened. I'm running things now. I handled all the operations while you were out. Everything is under control. I wanted to laugh, cry, punch him, and collapse all at once. I could see it in the accounts on his laptop, casually left open for me to stare at: withdrawals, unexplained transfers, canceled contracts. He had already siphoned off funds for himself, bought unnecessary equipment, and thrown caution to the wind with high-risk projects. This wasn't management. This was reckless chaos. I walked through the office slowly, observing every change. He had reorganized the staff like pieces on a chessboard, moving those loyal to me into corners, promoting his friends to positions they weren't qualified for. He had fired some of the veteran foremen who had been with the company for decades. Their faces were grim, filled with silent frustration, and I could see loyalty clashing with fear in their eyes. "Ivan," I said, my voice firm despite my weakness, "this isn't your company. These decisions, these changes, they can ruin everything we've built." He shrugged, lounging back in my favorite chair, the one I had spent hours in planning renovations and strategy. "Sometimes, you have to shake things up. You've been slow, Uncle Frank. Maybe you needed a fresh perspective." My hands shook as I realized the full scope of his arrogance. He wasn't just overstepping. He was rewriting history, pretending decades of effort were his idea. And worse, he had convinced some of my own staff to go along with him. I moved into my office, the room that had been my sanctuary for 32 years. My diploma awards and framed photos of completed projects stared back at me, now overshadowed by a giant flat screen Evan had installed. It wasn't just physical intrusion, it was symbolic. He was erasing me, my legacy, my very presence. Melissa approached cautiously. "Frank, I didn't want to tell you, but there's more. He's filed paperwork to list himself as CEO. Legally, for now, he's in charge." I felt the world tilt. My own nephew, armed with forged signatures and manipulation, had taken my company from me while I was incapacitated. I wanted to scream, to confront him, to tear the office apart, but I couldn't. Not yet. I needed strategy, not emotion. Over the next few days, I observed him closely, pretending to be weak and compliant while documenting everything. He paraded through the office, acting as if he were the king of a kingdom that wasn't his. He flaunted designer watches, a new sports car parked outside, and even bragged about an expensive new home he had invested in. Meanwhile, contractors called in with complaints about delayed payments, mishandled projects, and unfinished work. Clients who had trusted me were now questioning the integrity of the company, and I could hear their doubts creeping into conversations over the phone. Despite the chaos, I kept my calm. My body was still fragile, my energy limited, but my mind was sharp. I started taking notes, recording discrepancies, noting every misstep Evan made. Every reckless decision, every forged document, every unethical shortcut became evidence. And deep down, I felt a small spark of satisfaction, knowing that arrogance always leaves a trail, and Evan was leaving one everywhere. But it wasn't all numbers and paperwork. The emotional toll was heavy. Seeing someone I had raised betray me so thoroughly was like a knife twisting in my chest. I replayed memories of teaching him how to swing a hammer, showing him how to measure precisely, even taking him to my first big client pitch when he was 15. Every moment of guidance, every sacrifice, every bedtime story now felt like fuel for his audacity. The first confrontation came sooner than I expected. He cornered me in the conference room one morning, smiling as if he were hosting a TV show. "You know, Uncle Frank," he said, "you should let me run things. I have fresh ideas. You've done enough for this company already." I stared at him, calm but cold. "Enough. Evan, I built this company. I put my heart and soul into it. And while I was fighting for my life, you stole it from me." He laughed softly, a nervous, defensive laugh. "Stole. I'm just helping Uncle. You'd understand if you weren't, recovering." Recovering. The word burned in my ears. He was twisting the situation, making me feel powerless, making his theft seem like charity. I bit my tongue. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew the moment for anger would come. And it would be devastating. In the quiet of the office after that confrontation, I walked past my own desks, my own plans, my own tools, and I realized the full magnitude of what I faced. Not only had Evan claimed authority, but he had also divided loyalty, planted fear, and started the first domino of collapse. I could feel the tension in the walls, the unspoken questions of staff, the creeping fear of clients. Everything I had built was teetering, and the only way to save it was to play the long game. By the end of that first week back, I had mapped out a plan. I would observe, document, and wait for Evan to make a mistake big enough to reveal his incompetence. Every mismanaged project, every unpaid invoice, every rash decision would be his undoing. I couldn't confront him physically or emotionally yet. He had to fall on his own arrogance, and fall he would. As I left the office that evening, exhaustion weighing every step, I looked at the setting sun and felt a strange sense of clarity. Evan might have claimed the throne, but the crown he wore was already crooked. And soon, very soon, he would learn that you can't fake experience, you can't forge respect, and you certainly can't steal a lifetime of hard work without consequences. For the first few weeks, Evan strutted through the office like a king who had claimed his crown. But kings who inherit thrones without earning them often forget one truth. Power is only as strong as the foundation beneath it, and Evan's foundation was cracking fast. It started with the small mistakes. A contractor called late one evening, panic in his voice, reporting that a new high-end renovation in a historic district had been mismeasured and was at risk of failing inspection. A simple error, I thought, until I realized Evan had signed off on it, without reviewing the blueprints, without consulting Melissa, without even looking at the site photos I had painstakingly approved. Then came the unpaid suppliers. Evan, in his new bravado, thought he could impress everyone with flashy promises and a "we'll pay later" attitude. Lumber yards, hardware stores, and subcontractors started calling, threatening liens and lawsuits. The once unshakable reputation of Bennett Renovations, my pride, my sweat, my credibility, was teetering. I watched silently, documenting every call, every email, every misstep. It wasn't just revenge, it was strategy. Evan believed I was weak, that my hospitalization had rendered me powerless. But I was gathering ammunition. He also made the fatal mistake of firing loyalty. He replaced experienced foremen and skilled craftsmen with his friends. College buddies who had no clue about renovations, beyond what they'd seen on TV. A young man who couldn't differentiate a joist from a beam was suddenly supervising a multi-million-dollar project. The errors compounded, and soon the first client complaints landed in my personal email. Homes that should have been safe were now at risk. Deadlines were missed. Warranties threatened. One particular incident still makes my stomach churn. A high-profile client called me directly frantic. Their historic home, which Bennett Renovations had promised to restore to pristine condition, had been stripped down carelessly. Timbers were rotting, walls uneven, and windows installed incorrectly. The client, normally cordial and trusting, asked in disbelief, "Frank, what happened? Who's running this?" The irony was bitter. I was watching the empire I had built crumble from the inside, and the man responsible was blissfully unaware, or arrogant enough to think it was all just part of a new vision. Meanwhile, Evan's obsession with appearances grew. He invested thousands into a flashy showroom in the city center, a space designed more for selfies than clients. Luxury furniture, neon lights, digital displays, everything screamed wealth and success, but nothing improved the core operations. Suppliers weren't paid, projects were mismanaged, and his personal spending continued unchecked. I observed him during these days, noting his arrogance, the smug way he dismissed staff concerns, and the careless way he handled client calls. He was spiraling slowly and predictably. I documented every meeting, every signature, every reckless decision. This wasn't just preparation. It was the countdown to inevitable collapse. But it wasn't all business. I watched him unravel emotionally. The stress of maintaining a facade, the panic of late payments, the constant staff turnover, it weighed on him. Yet his ego wouldn't let him admit he was out of his depth. He lashed out at employees, mocked clients who complained, and flaunted successes that didn't exist. Every misstep fed into the growing storm. Then came the legal shockwaves. Evan, in his hubris, had taken out a high-interest loan using the company name as collateral, thinking it would fund his showroom and lifestyle. He didn't consult anyone. He didn't calculate the risk. When the first installment came due, he couldn't pay. The bank sent notices, the loan sharks called, and suddenly the empire he thought he controlled was teetering on the brink of financial disaster. Staff began to panic. Some who had been loyal to him abandoned their posts. Experienced subcontractors refused to work on projects unless paid up front. Clients withdrew contracts. I could feel the tension crackling in the office, the fragile illusion of Evan's authority dissolving under the weight of his incompetence. Every evening, I returned home exhausted but determined. I reviewed the documents I had gathered: forged signatures, mismanaged contracts, unpaid invoices, and complaints from clients and suppliers alike. Evan was leaving a trail that would make his downfall undeniable. And then came the day that cemented it. A major project, a high-end mansion renovation, was due for final inspection. Evan, confident as ever, assured the client everything was perfect. But during the inspection, structural flaws were uncovered. Timbers had been installed incorrectly, plumbing was faulty, electrical wiring unsafe. The inspector didn't mince words, This was dangerous and unacceptable. The client called me personally, frightened and frustrated. I calmed them, promised corrective measures, and quietly documented the inspection report. Evan had no idea I was already steps ahead. I didn't intervene publicly. I let the situation unfold. Watching him squirm, trying to make excuses, was painful in a way that was also strangely satisfying. By now, the media had started murmurs. Local news about delayed projects, client complaints, and staff unrest. I stayed in the shadows, allowing the storm to grow. Evan's flashy showroom, once his pride, now stood as a monument to his arrogance and poor judgment. The empire he thought he had claimed was unraveling fast, and I was patient, letting each thread come loose on its own. The final straw came when an urgent call from the bank confirmed that the collateral loan defaulted. The property used as security was at risk of being seized. Vendors were refusing to supply materials, threatening lawsuits. Even his friends, the ones he had installed in the office to support him, began quietly looking for new jobs. Panic replaced arrogance in his eyes. Evan didn't see the pattern yet. He thought these were isolated incidents, bad luck, temporary setbacks. But I could see the dominoes lining up perfectly, each ready to fall with a gentle push. And that push, it would come from the one person he had underestimated all along: me. I spent hours in my own office, going over the notes, preparing evidence, and thinking about strategy. Each mistake Evan made wasn't just a sign of his incompetence. It was proof, undeniable and irrefutable, of his theft, negligence, and betrayal. Soon, the world would see what I already knew, that a man who inherits power without earning it is doomed to fail. Even as Evan tried to maintain his show of confidence, cracks appeared everywhere. The staff whispered behind his back. Contractors refused to answer calls. Clients demanded explanations. And in private moments, I could sense his panic growing, though he tried to mask it with bravado. The empire he had so arrogantly built on deceit, arrogance, and reckless spending was about to crumble, and I would be ready to step back in. Not as a vengeful uncle, but as the rightful owner and protector of everything I had built. The collapse had begun, but Evan was still strutting through the office as if nothing had changed. Every phone call, every angry contractor, every client complaint seemed like a minor inconvenience to him, a test of his ego rather than reality. He didn't see it yet, but I did. I had watched every misstep, every reckless decision, every fraudulent signature he had forged while I lay in the hospital. And now, the time had come to act. I started quietly gathering everything I needed: documents, emails, contracts, bank statements, even internal memos where Evan's mistakes were noted. Melissa, who had been terrified to speak up before, now cautiously brought me reports she had held back. Veteran foremen who had stayed loyal gave detailed accounts of what Evan had changed, what he had ignored, and how he had mismanaged projects. Piece by piece, the puzzle of Evan's recklessness and betrayal took shape. I also hired a lawyer, Paul, the same grizzled veteran who had guided me through decades of business deals. When I walked into his office with the mountain of evidence, he raised an eyebrow. "Frank, this is solid. We're talking fraud, misappropriation of funds, possibly forgery. He's dug a very deep hole for himself." I nodded, feeling a surge of resolve. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice, protection, and reclaiming what was rightfully mine. For weeks, I had been patient, letting Evan's arrogance lead him into one mistake after another. Now, it was time to act, strategically and decisively. The first step was the staff. I met privately with those who had remained loyal: Melissa, a couple of foremen, and some trusted administrative personnel. I laid out a plan to document everything and ensure that, legally and operationally, Evan couldn't continue without exposure. They were cautious at first, worried about retaliation, but the mounting evidence of Evan's blunders made their support grow. Next came the clients. I reached out quietly to those affected by Evan's mistakes, explaining that I was taking steps to rectify the situation. They were surprised, relieved, and grateful. Their trust in me, built over decades, was stronger than Evan's flashy promises. Contracts were corrected, deadlines renegotiated, and most importantly, reputations restored. The ripple effect of Evan's failures was now fully visible, but I was there to steady the ship. Evan, of course, didn't see the storm coming. He continued to flaunt his showroom, flaunt his purchases, and flaunt his ego. But cracks appeared faster now. Vendors refused to supply materials unless paid up front. Contractors demanded guarantees. Clients began asking questions he couldn't answer. And each of these failures, documented meticulously, became evidence in my growing case against him. The showdown came one afternoon when I finally confronted him directly. I invited him into my old office, the room that had once been his training ground. The tension in the air was electric. He smiled, trying to maintain his arrogance. "Frank, come on. We can talk about this. I've been handling things for your own good." I looked him in the eye, steady and unyielding. "Handling things. You've stolen, mismanaged, and endangered everything I built. I've collected every piece of evidence, every mistake, every forgery. You're not running a company. You're running it into the ground." For the first time, I saw the mask slip. Panic flickered across his face. He stammered, tried to deflect, to charm, to intimidate. But all the charm, all the arrogance, all the fake confidence couldn't cover the mounting evidence. I laid out before him contractors' complaints, client inspections, unpaid invoices, bank defaults, and documentation of forged signatures. He tried to laugh, nervously at first, then more aggressively, but it was hollow. I could see the cracks widen in his expression, hear them in his voice. His empire, built on deceit, was collapsing, and he couldn't stop it. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten. I simply presented the truth, cold and undeniable. The staff who had remained loyal watched from a distance, their fear replaced with relief. The client reports, contractor affidavits, and legal documents left Evan with no room to maneuver. He was cornered, exposed, and utterly powerless. Then, in a moment that still burns in my memory, Evan fell silent. He looked down, shaking, realizing that everything he had flaunted, luxury, control, status, was gone. I offered him a chance to mitigate the damage. "Sign an acknowledgement of your mistakes, cooperate legally, and we can resolve this without further escalation." He hesitated, pride warring with desperation. I could see him calculating, weighing the collapse of his ego against the reality of losing everything. Finally, with a shaky hand, he took the pen and signed. Not out of remorse, not out of gratitude, but because he had no choice. Every misstep, every forged document, every act of arrogance had caught up with him. Once the legal documents were filed, the dominoes fell quickly. The bank froze the accounts tied to the collateral loan. Vendors demanded immediate payment and repossessed equipment when they didn't receive it. Clients formally withdrew contracts. The flashy showroom, once his pride, became a symbol of his failure. Staff left quietly, some relieved, some angry, some simply disgusted. Evan was left with nothing but the truth staring him in the face, and that truth was inescapable. And yet, in all this chaos, I felt no joy in vengeance. My heart ached for the family I had raised, for the nephew who had betrayed me, for the years of mentorship wasted. But I also knew that justice had been served, and my company, my employees, and my clients were finally safe. I had protected what I loved, and ensured that the lessons of loyalty, hard work, and integrity were preserved. The final confrontation, quiet and legal, rather than physical, had shattered Evan. He begged, pleaded, tried to negotiate, but the evidence was overwhelming. His empire, built on shortcuts, deceit, and arrogance, had crumbled in the face of patience, strategy, and truth. And I, though exhausted, finally felt the first spark of relief since the collapse began. As I sat in my office that evening, reviewing the signed documents, I reflected on the ordeal. Betrayal had a way of cutting deep, but it also revealed character. I had been betrayed, yes, but I had acted with foresight, integrity, and patience. And in the end, those qualities had ensured that justice, not chaos, prevailed. Evan had fallen, but the company, my legacy, was intact. And though the road ahead would require rebuilding, it would be done on solid ground, with loyalty, hard work, and honesty as its foundation. The showdown was over, the lesson delivered, and the empire, now secure, ready for restoration. The office was quiet the morning after Evan had signed the acknowledgement documents. The chaos that had consumed the past few weeks seemed almost surreal in its absence. Phones no longer rang with frantic complaints. Contractors no longer yelled down the lines, and the staff, those who had remained loyal, finally breathed. For the first time, Bennett Renovations felt like home again, the way it had for 32 years. I walked through the office slowly, my steps measured and careful, my body still weak from my hospitalization, but my mind sharper than ever. Each desk, each filing cabinet, each framed photo on the wall reminded me why I had fought so hard. This wasn't just a business, it was my life's work, a reflection of decades of sweat, sacrifice, and integrity. Ivan, on the other hand, was nowhere to be found. I knew where he was, his ego crushed, his illusions shattered, but I didn't go looking for him. There was no need. Karma had done what patience and strategy could not do on their own. The loans, the defaulted payments, the angry clients, and the departing staff had done their work. He had built his empire on arrogance, deceit, and carelessness, and it had collapsed in record time. Melissa approached me cautiously, holding a folder of reports and remaining client contracts. "Frank, it's really over. Everything is stabilized. The clients, the projects, they're all back on track." I smiled, a sense of relief washing over me. Good. That's how it should be. This company belongs to the people who work for it, the people who trust it, and to me, the person who built it. The first weeks of restoration were painstaking. Projects that had been neglected under Evan's rule needed urgent attention. Contractors had to be reassured, payments straightened out, and client relationships rebuilt. It wasn't glamorous work. It was detailed, demanding, and required patience. But with loyal staff by my side, I saw progress every day. Every corrected invoice, every satisfied client, every repaired home felt like a small victory, a restoration of what had been stolen. And then came the final twist, a moment I hadn't anticipated, but that carried a strange, poetic justice. A letter arrived in the mail, addressed to me in Evan's handwriting. I opened it cautiously. Inside was a short note. "Frank, I've moved to another state. I applied for a job at a local home improvement store. I used your name as a reference. I hope you understand." I sat back, reading the words twice, 3 times. My first instinct was disbelief, then irritation. The same nephew who had tried to steal everything from me was now relying on my reputation to survive. And yet, a small part of me couldn't help but feel satisfied. He had learned the hard way that shortcuts, arrogance, and betrayal lead only to ruin. I considered my response carefully. I could refuse, deny, or even punish him further, but what would that accomplish? Evan had already faced the consequences of his actions. Karma had done its work. All that remained was to decide whether to extend a hand or simply watch him navigate the life he had created for himself. I chose the former, not out of kindness, but as a calculated gesture of closure. In the weeks that followed, Bennett Renovations returned to its former glory. Client confidence surged, staff morale improved, and projects were completed on time and on budget. The company that Evan had nearly destroyed now shone brighter than ever, a testament to the value of experience, integrity, and relentless dedication. I also took time to reflect on the personal lessons of the ordeal. Betrayal by family cuts deep, far deeper than any corporate sabotage. It forces you to confront not only the actions of others, but also your own trust, patience, and judgment. I had raised Evan, taught him the principles of hard work, and yet he had chosen the path of deception. The sting of that betrayal lingered, but it also reinforced my understanding of human nature, the value of vigilance, and the necessity of strategic patience. One evening, sitting in my office and overlooking the city lights, I finally allowed myself a moment of quiet triumph. The empire was intact, the legacy secured, and the lesson delivered, not just to Evan, but to everyone who might be tempted to take shortcuts or betray trust. The scars of betrayal remained, yes, but they were outweighed by the satisfaction of justice, the loyalty of my staff, and the security of my life's work. Months later, I heard through mutual contacts that Evan had settled into his new life, working modestly and learning humility in a way no amount of lectures could have taught him. He had no company, no empire, and no shortcuts left. The arrogance that had propelled him toward destruction had been replaced by the slow, grinding reality of accountability. And in a strange way, that was more satisfying than any revenge I could have orchestrated. I returned to my office one morning, stepping past the tools, the files, and the walls lined with decades of hard work. I paused by the front window, looking at the crew's loading trucks, clients arriving, and the familiar rhythm of a business finally running as it should. It was a perfect reminder that patience, strategy, and integrity always outlast arrogance and deceit. As for Evan, I made a choice. I didn't hold a grudge, but I didn't coddle him either. Life had given him a lesson, and he would have to live with it. And in the quiet moments, when the office was calm and the city hummed outside, I felt a sense of closure, a story of betrayal, strategy, justice, and restoration complete. Bennett Renovations was no longer just a company. It was a testament to resilience, a monument to integrity, and a reminder that no empire, no matter how flashy, could survive without honesty, hard work, and respect for those who built it. And as for Evan, he would remember that lesson for the rest of his life.